Killian rechecked the address before looking up at the run-down old parking structure. 658 Throonwood Drive was a corner lot in Atlanta's business district. It should have been a towering glass edifice full of men in suits and women in blazers. It should have been a tech startup or a trendy bar. Hell, it should have been a functional parking garage at the very least. Instead, it was a crumbling 5-story concrete monstrosity. Spray paint and graffiti covered the walls, and the thick scrub grass grew up between the cracks in the cement. You could see the leavings of people, kids who had come to smoke, or homeless people looking to get out of the weather. Killian doubted that any of the people that lived around here thought about the place, beyond calling the cops if the kids got a little too rowdy or the homeless people got a little too drunk. As he stepped inside, he could already tell that it was cleaner than most places in such disarray. Homeless people stayed the night, but they never stayed for the whole night. Nicking teens and junkies looking for a place to flop did not come here after dark. Killian didn't need the little card in his pocket to tell him that this was a hot spot. Killian would wager that it practically thrummed after dark. He stepped inside the crumbling structure, stepping around the broken security arm that was there to keep the cars out until they'd paid for a ticket. Someone had snapped it in the middle, and now it just hung lamely, wobbling in the setting sun. The guard booth it fronted on had a window caked in dust, and the seat inside was a chewed hole fit only for mice. On the desk sat a lonely can of Pepsi that had likely been there for about a decade. Killian betted there was even still Pepsi in the bottom of it. He kept moving, kept looking for her. She was the reason he'd been sent here by the agency. She had caused quite a stir when she'd given a homeless man a heart attack and scared the other 3 nearly to death. They had run, but the man had stayed. He stayed, and she had fed on him. She had tasted life force, and that was why he was here. She was a ticking time bomb, and he was here to offer her a way back before it was too late. If it wasn't already too late, that was. He found her sitting on the hood of a rusty car on the deck below this one. In the semi-darkness, she appeared as any other little girl might. She wore a school uniform, though the garment was filthy with dirt and mud. Her dark hair hung limply in one sodden pigtail, and he could see a single bare sock dangling next to a shiny leather shoe. She sat far too still for a child, staring at the sunset through a hole in the far wall as he approached. Then, she spoke suddenly. Her voice was cultured but thick, like a delicate china doll sinking in a mud puddle.
You've come to be rid of me, haven't you?
Killian stopped. He was nearly 10 feet from her, and if something was going to happen, then he would rather it happen now. Ghosts were unpredictable at the best of times, but this little girl was no ghost. Not anymore. She was edging towards something darker, something far more destructive. If Killian couldn't stop her, then she'd be unreachable, unsavable. They'd have to put her down like a dog with the rabies.
Are you Madeline Arlo Register?
I am.
The agency has sent me to...
Without warning, she turned. He had seen her from the back, in profile, but as she turned, Killian realized that those stains weren't all mud. The uniform shirt was a patchwork of dried blood and old stab wounds. Someone had stabbed her a dozen times in the chest and belly. The left side of her face hung in tatters, strips of flesh hanging like grisly streamers from her soft white skull. Her left eye was dark, put out forever, but a little spark danced there now. As she turned, he saw the colossal metal frame of the car she was sitting on fly towards him. He stood his ground, best not to let the ghost see you flinch, and her sneer turned to something like confusion as the rusty hulk slid through him and slammed into the wall behind him. Killian gave her a flash of teeth.
Is that how your mother taught you to greet guests, Madeline?
She gawked at him. No mean feat with half a face.
How did you...
You're not the only one who ceased to be a person some time ago. My name is Killian Barger, and I am here to stop you before you do yourself irreparable damage.
Damage myself? Look at me. I'm slashed to bloody tatters. How much more damaged could I become?
Killian stepped in closer, not something he strictly wanted to do, and bent to eye level with this grisly shade.
If you continue on the way you are, you will cease to be a spirit. You'll become something different. You'll become something that cannot move on.
Her good eye clouded with tears then. She seemed unsure of whether to put her head against him, whether he would allow such a thing. He solved her problem by pulling her to him and letting her rest her gruesome face against his long coat. Even in life, Killian had never been one to let a child's anguish go uncomforted because of a little thing like a mess on his coat. She left no stain, of course. How could she? Madeline had been dead for 10 years now. Her worries about stains and messes were well beyond her.
I needed to kill them. We needed to kill them. We have to be stronger when he comes back.
We?
Even as he spoke, though, he could see them on the fringes of the parking garage. Maybe she wasn't afraid to sit in the light, but they still cringed from it. As full dark came, however, he saw them shuffling to see what troubled their sad guardian. Toddlers in overalls, girls in gingham dresses with blood in their curls, boys in suits, boys in undershirts, children who were in various states of undress. The dirty, grubby masses that made this place their home came shambling from the shadows and approached him. Killian could do nothing but gape at them. The agency had told him about David Maginsk, of course. The agency knew how he had murdered children since the early 50s and dumped their bodies in this parking garage when it had still been an empty lot. David was old now, an old business that many of these ghosts would have to settle before they moved on. But still, he killed them. Still, they feared him. Still, he swelled their ranks. The agency knew about the 53 children of David Maginsk, the ones he had murdered in his 67 years of life. But the agency did not involve itself in matters of the living. Killian, however, did.
When was the last time he was here?
He came back 3 months ago when he killed Angelica.
Madeline indicated a dark-haired girl with brown skin who had wandered close. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, but her head had been almost entirely obliterated. The girl stared at Killian through the dirt and grime that stained her face, her smushed face that resembled a Halloween jack-o'-lantern that had begun to rot and collapse. She stared at him like she thought Killian might raise her from the dead.
He drove by yesterday. He only drives by to case the place right before he brings someone new here.
I need to go make a call. When he comes, I want you to call me on this.
Killian handed her a small silver whistle from his pocket, and Madeline looked at the object dubiously.
A whistle?
Killian smiled at her.
You know how to whistle, don't you? Just put your lips together and blow.
Dom filled the glass with whiskey and took a long pull. The Casey Reed disappearance was a real pain in the ass. 4 different agencies, the state police, the local yokels, and even the feds were involved in this citywide search for Casey. Casey, the archetypally rebellious 13-year-old girl, also happened to have a pair of wealthy parents and a grandfather who was a councilman. If even half the disappearances Dom had investigated in the last 10 years had been from families as wealthy as these, Dom was confident they would have gotten this monster off the street by now. That's right. Despite what Captain Cedric thought of the idea, Dom was confident that all of these crimes were connected. Children had been going missing in the less affluent areas for the past 30 years. Most of them amounted to dead ends and cold cases, but Dom had personally found many of them buried in the lot on Thronewood. The police, of course, didn't want to hear about some pervert who targeted kids from low-income families. They wanted results, and Dom could only give them closure instead of arrests. God, but he'd been close with Madeline Register. A private school girl goes missing, parents come to him for results, but yet again, the bastard had slipped through his fingers. He'd nearly had him then, had a make and model on the car, a witness placing him at the private school on the day of the disappearance. He'd been so close, but the he was what eluded him. The guy was a ghost, never leaving more than a residual impression on people, and when the car had come up as little more than a burnt husk, Dom had been all out of clues. Killian would have been able to find him, Dom said, topping off his glass again. Killian had been the best detective at the agency, the best cop on the force, and the best friend Dom had ever had. Without Killian, Dom felt like he was just barely getting by. He knocked back the whiskey and glanced at his partner's old chair. He'd left it just the way Killian had before going missing 8 years ago. After 8 years, you just gave up on ever seeing someone again. But not a day went by that Dom didn't hope that Killian would walk through that door again, and Dom's glass smacked roughly against the floor of the small apartment. Killian was sitting in the chair, hands steepled behind his head, staring at Dom from behind his old battered desk, just like he had in the old days.
It's been a while, Dom.
Killian, what the hell, man? You can't just... Where have you been for the last 8 years? Dom took in his old friend and found that Killian looked exactly the same as the day he'd left to chase his final lead. His coat was immaculate, his salt and pepper hair still snug against his hat, and his face... You dead, aren't you? Dom asked, picking up his glass and filling it again.
I'm afraid so. Turns out there's still a place for gumshoes like us, though. Even on the other side, there are people in need of a keen eye and a quick mind.
Dom mulled that over as he drank. Dom wasn't young, and seeing Killian had probably brought him one step closer to his inevitable grave. It gave him a queer sort of comfort, though, knowing that the light didn't just go out after you stopped paying the bills. Something after death wasn't news you got handed every day. So, why are you here? Dom asked, trying to find his cool again.
I've got a lead for you, partner. A lead that I imagine will help you find Casey Reed.
Dom pricked up his ears. Yeah, well, I sure could use one. Every cop in the damn city's looking for her. I know her parents would love to have her home for more than just a viewing.
David Majensk has her.
Dom's eyebrows shot way up. I investigated him a couple of years ago. He was a prime suspect in that string of abductions, but it just never panned out. He had an airtight alibi, and people to back it up.
He has friends who are afraid of him, people who will lie on his behalf. He's the one who's been leaving bodies at the old Thronewood site.
He's the one dumping bodies? Dom was shocked. He'd have to have been killing
since he was 17 years old.
Dom sat back in his chair and sipped at his whiskey. And I suppose that telling the cops that the ghost of my dead partner came and told me this won't amount to a hill of beans and only serve to get me locked in the local mental ward.
Afraid so. Looks like you'll have to go and do the legwork if you want to see this case put to bed.
Killian flashed that careworn smile he had always worn, and it warmed Dom's heart to see it. He stood up, taking his hat off the desk, and turned back to look at an empty seat. Thanks, partner. He smiled. Killian had given him a hell of a lead, and now it was time to chase it. How much had Atlanta changed in the 8 years since he'd lived there? The people bustled up and down the streets. The towering glass buildings winked and glistened even by night, and the hum and thrum of the streets still moved him towards his old haunts. He was standing outside a tavern near his office. It had been called Saffron, but it was now a small wine bar named Genesis. How many nights, how many times had he sat inside with Dom and had a beer? How many times had Sandra, Saffron's bartender, come out after last call to talk about the old neighborhood with them? Was she still there, he wondered, slinging wine and talking about the old days? He had taken a step towards the front window when an ear-splitting whistle raked across his senses. He stepped away and turned towards the business district. His curiosity would have to wait. He was on the clock, after all. David pulled into the familiar spot beside the old lot and shut off the lights. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath as he savored the feel of the moment. He liked to emblazon this part in his mind, so later, when he was alone in his bed, he could recall it with crystalline clarity. He held the knife up to inspect it, opening his eyes to see the keen blade, the rough wooden handle that was still stained from a lifetime of killing. Then, the bitch in the back seat kicked his seat and ruined his moment. She had been impossible from the first moment he had found her on the sidewalk. When he stumbled across her, David had thought himself lucky. Here was someone whom he wouldn't have to lure into his car or trick into his house with the promise of treats or money. The girl was passed out on the sidewalk, a raging house party thrumming in the background. He had loaded her into his car with minimal effort and thought himself quite lucky. When she had awakened halfway to his house, however, the trouble had begun. She had kicked and screamed and accused him of any number of improper things. He had barely managed to find the sedative in his glove box, plunging the needle into her neck as she tried to pull his door handle off. But that was far from the end of it. The last 3 days were a constant reminder of why David did not abduct, teenagers. They were loud, they were rude, and they generally could not easily be cowed by fear or violence. Every other word out of her mouth was an expletive, or her telling him how much he probably wanted to screw her. David shuddered at the thought of it. He was not a sex pervert. He did not like to have sex with children. He was, however, a murderer, and he was about to receive his climax. He took her out of the back seat, trussed and gagged, and carried her into the garage. She struggled. The stupid brats always struggled. Why couldn't they be quiet, like the little angels he usually brought down here? Most of them went sobbing quietly, or just limp in resignation. Not all of them, though. That little bitch with the pigtails had kicked him in the face just before he could put her down. Oh, that had made him mad. He'd been madder still when he realized that she was trying to escape. Well, he had shown her, hadn't he? He usually liked to do them quick. One quick cut across the neck or one quick jab to the throat. But this little bitch had made him really mad. He'd put the knife in her eye, hard enough to pop it like a grape. Then he had dug the knife down in the socket, cutting her face into a grim caricature as she thrashed and screamed around the gag he had stuffed in her mouth. Then he had stabbed her over and over and over until, finally, the knife blade had snapped into the pavement under her. He flopped his latest victim down onto the pavement, hard enough to bounce her head. That had been a wake-up call for him. Not to stop killing, but, to curb his lack of control. He had the knife repaired after he'd dug the tip out of the girl's chest. Now, when he looked at the patched part, he felt a calm come over him, and he knew that he needn't hurry. As he looked down at the girl as she struggled, David knew he had all night if he needed. When the rock smashed into the back of his head, he spun around in sudden anger. He could feel the blood rushing from the back of his scalp, but as he scanned the parking deck, he could see no one. As he stood tracking, his knife held out offensively, another rock struck him in the side of the head. He staggered, turning in the direction the stone had come from. Now he saw her. She was standing on a rusty old car that had been there since the 70s, and her arm was still extended from the throw. She was in some kind of school uniform. A costume, probably. His eye was blurry. The rock had hit close to the eye, but he thought maybe she looked familiar. When she lifted her head to grin at him, he knew why. He took a step back, a scream rising in his throat. It couldn't be her. She was dead. He had killed her. He had put her eye out and torn her face and stabbed her until he could see the shadows lengthening from behind her as a wave of bodies rose from the blackness. The hands, the torn and bloodied hands, rose like a column of dark beneath her. The children, his angels, they began to boil from the shadows of the dark garage. Their eyes were like dark pools with no bottoms, and their faces held none of the joy he would have expected. They had been street children, unwashed, unloved. He had sent them on to something better. He was their savior, their provider, He tripped over the struggling body of his soon-to-be latest victim, but she hardly seemed to matter. The throng of children was approaching, that pigtailed apparition pushing them onward, and he knew a fear that he had never known before. Not when the police had come to talk to his daddy after he'd killed his first. Not after the state police had pulled him over when he had that girl in the trunk in 73. Not even when his daddy had come to him drunk one night and made him feel as shameful as his mother always had. He loosed a high and warbled scream and crab-walked backwards on his palms. The mob was coming for him, rolling over the trussed girl as they came for him, and the lights from the street suddenly flickered and grew dark. A figure stood amongst them, his long form denoting an adult, and he glared at David with the eyes of an avenging angel. He had passed judgment on David, sentenced him to a hell worse than any lake of fire, and now he would pay for his crimes. The small hands clutched at him, nails digging into him as they drew him into their miasma. As they carried him away, They brought him face to face with the pigtailed general. As he reclined before her, held in place by his many victims' hands, she stood over him with her torn face a leering mask. She lifted the knife over him, David wondering when he had lost it, as the steel rose to take him as he had taken so many. The ruined side of her face wore a terrible smile, her other side a frozen mass of tissue, and she plunged the knife downward in a slow arc. A bright light suddenly washed over him, and he could hear many voices advising him to freeze. David opened his eyes. He was surrounded by no less than 30 ununiformed policemen, all pointing guns at him and telling him to put down the knife and step away from the girl. He looked down and found that he was crouching over the bound girl, crotch inches from her struggling chest, as he prepared to run the blade down and end her life. Where were the children? Where was the avenging angel? What had happened? Something hit him in the chest, and he fell backwards onto the ramp. Someone had shot him with a beanbag launcher, a blow that would leave him with a terrible bruise that wouldn't heal for weeks. The police were on him then, laying rough hands on him and putting cold steel cuffs on his wrists. They were untying his victim. They were taking her away. As he struggled, someone put a fist in his stomach and he nearly vomited. He slumped, which gave him a prime view of the two-faced girl between the crook of a policeman's arm. She waved cheerily at him as he went into the back of a squad car, and David moved to look out the window, hoping to see her again. But he never saw another child again for the rest of his life. Not in life, anyway, and the ones he saw after death were no angels. Dom smiled as Captain Cedric shook his hand. It was done grudgingly, and only after Counselor Reed had given his whole arm a heartfelt pump. The press drugged the counselor away then, and Cedric stood next to the grizzled detective as the two waited their turn. "How in the blue hell did you know where to find that girl?" Cedric breathed. Dom only shrugged, but the satisfied smile just wouldn't leave him. "Just plain old detective work, Cedric. You used to know what that was, as I recall." Cedric kept his smile, but there was a sneer hidden beneath it. "Don't give me that shit. We comb the whole city in half a hell, and you find this girl by, what, pounding the pavement, hassling toughs down at the dock?" Dom let his eyes roam over to the parking garage. "I've been telling you about the bodies dumped here for almost 15 years now, haven't I?" "Yeah, and we ID the remains, but we never catch anyone coming to dump." "Well, I've liked David McGinsk for the dumper for quite some time now, a tidbit I shared with you as well." Cedric did grimace that time. "Yes, and a tidbit that we researched and found to be most unlikely. The guy had alibis and witnesses, and he had people willing to lie for him, that's all. I found a source willing to talk, willing to tell me how his old man actually owned this parking garage. When his old man died a few decades ago, the garage went to his only living relative, young David here. He owns the place. He knows where he can and can't dump the bodies, and he could easily come up with an excuse for being there." "And your witness told you all that?" Cedric asked. "Mind putting a name to this solid citizen?" Dom's eyes widened a little, but when he looked back at the crumbling third story of the garage, the figure was gone. For a second, he could have sworn he'd seen a familiar coat up there. "Sorry, Cap. My sources are strictly off the books." From the roof, Killian and Madeline watched the cop cars roll away. Now we'll get what's coming to him, Killian thought. No quick death for David McGinsk. He'll have plenty of time to think about his actions before the end. At least, Killian hoped so. David McGinsk had a lot to think about. Madeline didn't look at him, just watched the cop cars as they rolled away.
So, what happens now?
Now, you must come with me to the agency.
With you?
Your charges should be able to move on now, their business at an end. You, however, have killed the living, and must now answer for your crimes.
She looked away, tears falling from her good eye. When she cried, Killian really could believe that she was only a 10-year-old girl. He could see the bright young lady she had been, the potential that was wasted when a madman had ended her on the bricks below. and he felt sorry for her. He lifted her chin, and she looked at him, hopeful again.
I believe that, given the circumstances, they may go easy on you. But you must face what you've done with the same bravery that you faced your killer.
I'm ready.
She stood, taking his hand and walking away stoically with him, as the two of them walked into the Aether, together. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's video. Well, I do hope you enjoyed the voice talents of two fast friends of the channel, the Baron, who you know, and LadyNopeingham, who I'm hoping that you get to know. I'll be leaving links to their channels in the description, so if you'd like to go give them a watch, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. I know I appreciate them for helping me out, and for all the great work they do for the spooky community at large. I dare say this is far from the last Killian Barger story we'll be getting, so keep your eyes peeled. There will definitely be more to come. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I ask that if you're not already subbed, maybe go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you like what you heard, maybe go ahead and hit the bell too. I wouldn't want you guys to miss any of the great content that we make on this channel. We update 3 times a week, and it would be a real shame if you missed a story. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghost Rider tier contributor. Thanks, guys. I just couldn't do it without you. It warms my heart daily, knowing that there are people out there that believe in me, especially enough to give to me financially. If you too would like to support the show, then come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can join our Spooky Skeleton tier army and have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd rather buy a book, I've got a link to my Amazon account. I might suggest Dark Vortex, which is my second book, and it's what we're reading on our Wednesday reads, so get your own copy. Then you can, join our little book club we've got going. It'll be a lot of fun. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.